If you don't know me, I'm this year's president of the Alexander Hamilton Society. I'm Kelsey Eldred, senior here and studying diplomacy and comparative religion. But I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today. We're hoping for an exciting discussion. We have Mr. Van Serchuk currently lectures in law at Columbia Law School and serves as the executive director of the KKR Global Institute, where he is responsible for geopolitical analysis with particular focus on trends in defense, security, and emerging markets. In the past, Mr. Serchuk served as the Senior National Security Advisor to Senator Joseph Lieberman, where he worked on a broad range of international security issues, including Iran and Russian sanctions legislation, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Asia-Pacific strategy. Accompanying him today, we have our very own Dr. Emily Chanel Justice, a Miami University visiting professor from the Global and Intercultural Studies program. Dr. Chanel Justice's research and interests include protests and social movements, gender and feminism, human rights, economic development, and an overall regional focus on Eastern Europe. She is currently researching on economic development in Ukraine and Romania with particular interest in the information technologies and tourism sectors. Outside of her research, Dr. Chanel Justice is also a book review editor for Anthropology of East Europe Review. So on behalf of Alexander Hamilton Society and the Miami Student Body, I want to thank you both for agreeing to speak today, and let's give them a warm round of applause.
So for our first question, we have, what capabilities does the Russian government have to interfere in U.S. elections?
Great opening question and a timely one. And let me say thank you so much to all of you guys for coming out to hear us, and to Alexander Hamilton Society for sponsoring this. So the Russians have developed a number of capabilities. Probably the one which has become the most prominent is their use of social media and particular an organization called the Internet Research Agency, to try to effectively impersonate Americans, to then try to insert themselves into our political discourse, and to do so around a variety of issues, including midterm elections. In general, what we've seen, though, with respect to the Russians is that it's not that they are backing one side or another. It's not that they want one team to win and the other team to lose. Their interest is rather much more about trying to exacerbate social division inside the country. So even more than the midterm elections, what we've seen is, imagine every sort of hot button issue in our society today. What they will do is use social media to try to back both sides, which on the one hand seems kind of intrinsically and inherently kind of strange, right? Why would you back both sides? And the answer is because they basically like to see us tear ourselves apart. So simultaneously, they will be ramping up Black Lives Matters and Blue Lives Matters and trying to use the most kind of divisive, destructive rhetoric out there. So on any number of issues. With respect to the midterm elections, whenever anything divisive comes up, what we've found is that the Russian bots, Russian social media activists are involved in kind of trying to pour fuel on the fire on both sides. So that's the most direct and probably prominent. There are other things that the Russians conceivably could do. We've not seen evidence of them doing it yet. One of the scenarios that there's been a great deal of concern about would be kind of direct interference in the infrastructure of the elections themselves, right? So if trying to hack into voting tabulations, trying to kind of create chaos. Again, not necessarily because there's one candidate they'd like to win or one candidate they'd like to lose, but rather to try to create distrust and chaos in the system itself. A great deal of concern about that issue over particularly the last 2 years. There was concern about it in 2016 as well. But that's not really where we've seen the Russians being the most active. It's been much more, again, about trying to kind of pour fuel on the fire of our own debates.
And I would add to that that a lot of the evidence that we have that supports those ideas is from the region, from Eastern Europe and other countries where they've done precisely this. Ukraine is a great example. Georgia is another really good example. But countries where you have already existing tensions, exacerbating those tensions, making politics be a sphere where it's really difficult to find some kind of happy medium, that has kind of been what has been happening in the region over the past, I don't know, 2 decades maybe. And it's effective. It's really effective. The Ukrainian situation is pretty unstable at this point. And that is largely because of continued influence, thanks to this information and thanks to other mechanisms of trying to foment instability. And I would argue that that is really the intention. The intention is, like you say, not to get one candidate elected over another, but the intention is to foment discord, to create instability. The result of this, of course, being that Vladimir Putin is, seen as this very powerful guy who can do all of these things, and who has a stable political situation and his, enemies or challengers or whoever in the United States doesn't have that because we have too much discord.
Yeah, I mean, it is like a little bit like a parody of the old James Bond movies where like the villain wants, like the Soviet Union and America to go to war so that in turn then he can rule over the smoking ruins of civilization. The Russian strategy is in a way that, only it's within American society itself. I would, in fairness, though, caveat 2 things, right? You said, both of us have said, they don't really want particular candidates to win. When you look back in 2016, a couple of things. One, they really wanted Hillary Clinton to lose. And they had their particular reasons for that. Putin had his particular reasons for that, particularly associated with what happened in Russia in 2011, 2012. There had been a parliamentary election. People went out into the streets to protest the election because it was blatantly rigged. And the Russians were surprised, the Russian government was surprised by how actually social media was used to expose what happened. So people, suddenly like the tricks that they'd been using for several years under Putin suddenly got exposed because people had these, right? And they were able to like upload them to social media, and suddenly people were going out into the streets. And at this particular moment, people were protesting. Some international organizations basically were saying, look, this election is not free and fair. And then Secretary of State Clinton was asked about it at a conference that she was attending, and she criticized the election. President Putin, actually at the time still Prime Minister Putin, because it was taking place in this strange interregnum when he had basically stepped back from the presidency, become Prime Minister, although there was still kind of belief that in many respects he was calling the shots, came out and said, you see, what's happening in the streets now is not that actually Russians have spontaneously risen up, it's because she, Clinton, gave the signal. And that the reason that we have this unrest is because the Americans have engineered it. Now, this is important in another respect as well. To the Russians, I should say, to be more precise about this, to the Putin government, because it's also very important to distinguish between the Russian people, everyday Russians, and this regime. They're not the same, right? But to the Putin regime, what they are doing, they believe, is no different from what they accuse the United States of having done over the past decades. Right? They believe, and I can say as someone who's worked in the US government at a fairly high level, would that this were true, it would be really great. But it's not true. That like the CIA has this machine where they can kind of press a button and cause Russians or Ukrainians or Georgians to go out into the street and overthrow regimes we don't like. And so what they've been trying to do, in a strange way, is mirroring what they believe we have been doing. Now, we've not been doing that. When you have had these uprisings in places like Ukraine, been successful in 2004, and then again in 2014, Georgia, 2003, and various other places, they happened because of genuine grassroots anger at the fact that like these governments were thieves, right? They were stealing their people's blood. But from the Russian perspective, the Russian government perspective, they don't really assign that much agency to the crowd. And so when they try to stir up a crowd, it sort of is like their view of this is how these things happen. And so, okay, Americans have been doing this to us. Now it's going to be our turn. We're going to start giving you back some of the medicine that you've been delivering to us.
Okay. So we mentioned Eastern Europe a few times. Do you think there's anything that we can learn from the Eastern European states that have kind of gone through this already? Have they found a way to counter it, or is there something we just kind of learn from their mistakes?
I think that's a really hard question, because on the one hand, we do see in Ukraine, I did research, I happened to be in Ukraine in September of 2013, 2 months later, mass mobilization started happening, and I stayed in Ukraine until it ended in June of 2014. And I was really involved with activist groups who were also involved in the protests, and what I saw through them was really, really, truly grassroots mechanisms of mobilizing people, but that were not necessarily based on the expectation that people would show up. They really didn't know what was going to happen, and so they were using things like, special internet browsers to make it so that nobody, their ISP address, was masked so that nobody would know they were working from Ukraine, or they would get burner phones and then have like a handwritten list of phone numbers, and if you were on the list, you would get a text message that was like, okay, show up at this time in this place. Really, so like really, seemingly, I don't know, given our access to technology, kind of interesting mechanisms to actually get people to show up, and that in addition to things like Facebook. Although once the government started cracking down, people were a lot more, careful about that sort of thing. And that mobilized hundreds of thousands of people into the streets for 7 months, which is a really long time, and it was really cold. So that's amazing. Now, some of those things continue to exist. For example, the regime under Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president at the time, kind of took control over most of the TV channels. And so people started using their phones or finding GoPro cameras and just taking them and live streaming everything that was happening. That's how you knew that the police were beating up protesters. That's how they counted bodies when people started getting shot, right? So some of those turned into actual TV stations and radio stations that still exist today that are still more dependent from regimes and from any kind of government funding than other TV channels. There's a really good website if you want to check out called stopfake.org, which is a fact-checking website, but it's based in Ukraine. That was based on Russian misinformation campaigns that were circulating photos and news stories that it was a lot of like gruesome war images and stuff like that they were saying, well, this is happening in Ukraine right now. It was images from Syria and from Libya and that sort of thing. So those types of grassroots initiatives I think were really effective. In terms of regime change, not very much has changed. People are still really dissatisfied with the regime. Trust in institutions remains really, really low. Trust in volunteer organizations, trust in those types of grassroots organizations that were established during the protest, that is high. But the trust in the actual institutions remains really low, which suggests to me that there wasn't really that much institutional reform despite these mass mobilizations. But if you look at lower levels, and if you look at the networks that have been established at those lower levels, you do see a kind of shift in what people can accomplish, how people can counteract Russian misinformation, Russian efforts based on cyber attacks and that sort of thing. So I don't know if it's a lesson per se, but it informs us about how at least to start kind of tackling some of those questions.
So I would only add, so probably for most of the people in this room, for as long as you've been politically or geopolitically aware, Russia has seemed problematic. Right, so 2014 is when the events in Ukraine happened, again, popular uprising against a corrupt dictator, Yanukovych, who's linked to Russia, largely over the issue of whether Ukraine is going to be able to join an economic agreement with the European Union, which in turn then triggers this Russian intervention, first with the capture of Crimea, and then we can move into Eastern Ukraine and the war, which has continued ever since. That was sort of the moment when I think most Americans really began to say, we have a Russia problem again. Right? But when you actually look at what had been going on in Central and Eastern Europe for the preceding decade, everything that you see in the news today that alarms people about Putin, he actually has been doing for some time. Right? So recently, the attempted poisoning of a KGB defector in the UK. Well, it was 2005, a former Russian intelligence operative who had gone into exile in the UK was murdered using a radioactive element. That's cyber. 2007, Estonia, former Soviet republic, now a plucky democracy, which is a member of NATO, member of the EU, moved a statue, which was a World War II era statue, post-World War II era statue that commemorated the Soviet liberation of Estonia. The problem being that from the Estonian perspective, what happened after World War II when the Soviets took over was not exactly a liberation so much as a conquest and occupation. So they thought maybe it would be a nice idea to move the statue. The response, massive cyber attack on Estonia. That was 2007. So all these things have been playing out actually in the near abroad for some time. What's changed is that it's only been in the last few years that we, the US, Western Europeans, have really begun to sit up and take notice. As for sort of tactics for countering it, look, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, the first is when you actually look at attitudes towards Russia in places where they have gone on the offensive, like Ukraine, they've not won themselves a lot of friends. And so, in a bizarre way, I would argue that if you think about Ukraine, Ukraine is a place that historically had a lot of deep pro-Russian sentiment. No place in the world which is culturally, linguistically, religiously, historically closer to Russia than Ukraine. The earliest Russian state was formed on the territory of Ukraine, which is one of the reasons why for the Russians, it's also, Ukraine has such extraordinary importance. As a result of the way in which the Putin government has behaved in Ukraine, Ukrainians have been pushed west. And you see this playing out actually most dramatically right now in a schism over the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which historically has looked to Moscow, which is now effectively broken away from the Russian Orthodox Church, which is an event of extraordinary historical importance. I would submit that what's the most appropriate response to what Russia is doing? Well, the starting point is to be aware of what Russia is doing. Look, we're Americans. The idea that we actually have arguments amongst ourselves about pretty much everything, like that's kind of what we do, right? We don't regard that actually as a source of weakness. That's actually one of our strengths. Right? It's actually only in the mind of an authoritarian regime that if you have social disagreement, political disagreement, that surely must weaken a society. That's not the way that we think about it, right? The flip side, though, is what do they want to see? Well, they want to see us ripping each other's faces off. So drawing that distinction between let's have an argument about all sorts of things, right? Because we're a big country of 320 million people who are going to disagree about a lot of things. But let's also try to remember that when we get so to the point that we treat each other like enemies, as opposed to fellow citizens who happen to disagree on things, we have someone in the corner who's definitely not our friend, who's actually rooting that process on and actively trying to do everything he can to encourage it.
Thank you. So looking more at the United States, do you think that there's the same level of interference as there was in the 2016 election going on currently with the midterms? And do you think that they might have changed their strategies in some ways since the 2016 elections?
Yeah, so as far as was can be detected, and keeping in mind we still have a few weeks to go, The kind of extremely aggressive effort that played out in 2016 around the presidential election, it is not taking place now. See much more continued emphasis around some of these hot-button social issues than around the midterm elections. But there still is some activity that is absolutely taking place. The Internet Research Agency, which was established by a guy who had previously been, the joke for him is that he's called Putin's chef, because he was a caterer for the Kremlin and for Mr. Putin before he decided to go into another lucrative line of work, which was creating his little internet startup. It still is up and running. So that activity is there, but again, much more focus, it seems, on the hot-button social issues. There's also, again, though, a lot of concern about watching to see if there are any signs of attempts to infiltrate the electoral infrastructure. I should have said, in the initial question, other ways in which they can interfere in the elections. It's also not just the social media, but something that we saw also in 2016, right, was hacking into the computers of political actors in the United States, the Clinton campaign, the DNC, exfiltrating information and then weaponizing it, right? Releasing it into the public through cutouts like WikiLeaks and sort of propitious moments to try to basically mess around with our own political discourse. And so that's also something which absolutely took place in 2016. That's not something that we've seen thus far as a tactic that they've attempted in any kind of significant way in 2018. But this requires basically constant vigilance. And in truth, when you look back on 2016, it's not to say that ultimately, whenever something like this happens, we have to be very clear. The only party to blame is the party that perpetrated it. But the defenses that were in place, the cyber defenses, the kind of protocols, they caught us with our pants down, right? And there were a lot of just basic things that could have been done, right? Like presumably on all of you have phones, and like your passwords are not like 1, 2, 3, 4. If they are, like please change them right now. Right. So in the event that you are, say, the national committee of a major political party, you probably should have some pretty sophisticated cyber defenses. That was definitely not the case in 2016. I think that's been an area where there's been some learning that's taken place.
So, in terms of national security, where do you think these kind of sustained attacks kind of place the U.S.?
It's an interesting question. When you say national security and how it places the U.S., what do you mean?
So, kind of looking at our position abroad, looking at kind of our current objectives in the Middle East, our alliances with European nations, do you think there's a Russian attempt to kind of undermine those efforts?
Sure. Look, so I think as a general proposition, the view of Putin is that American strength and power in the world is bad. It's intrinsically problematic, and it's a threat to him. And so therefore, weakening the United States, discrediting American democracy, exacerbating social division in the United States, making it harder for us to be able to operate in a coherent and credible way in the world, all of that is good. And again, it comes back to the question of well, why? Why care? Right? Because if you actually look at the history of what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, right? For every president, from President Clinton to President Bush to President Obama, and for that matter, President Trump came to office saying, what would be awesome if we can be friends with the Russians? Right? Why can't we work together in the world? Right? Because we have all these interests in common. And the list basically didn't change that much in 25 years. Look, we have a shared interest in thwarting terrorism. Right? We're all threatened by terrorists. We have a shared interest in preventing nuclear proliferation. We two nations have the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. We'd really rather not see other countries like Iran get nuclear weapons. Right? That should surely be in our interest. We have an interest in both being prosperous. We want, we want Russia to become a wealthy society, so that, not least so that we can trade with them. We have an interest in energy security. For many years, actually, after 9/11 in particular, the view was, we've been dependent. This was in the sort of the pre-American energy revolution boom, but we have an interest in trying to wean ourselves away from unstable Middle Eastern oil, places like Saudi Arabia. Russia is one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. We should be working with them. So what went wrong? That is a huge question, which we can spend a lot of time on, but the short answer, I think, really comes back to the character of a government matters tremendously. And as the Putin government became more authoritarian, more dictatorial, the prospects for a cooperative relationship with the United States began to shrink. And that isn't because, we had moralists in the White House who said, we're going to put our values first, and therefore we're going to confront Putin about his abuse of dissidents and the fact that journalists are getting killed, which, by the way, started fairly early. Right? Some of the most impressive crusading investigative journalists in Russia 10, 12 years ago started to be mysteriously killed. One of the most famous of them, Anna Politkovskaya, did pioneering work in Chechnya, strangely enough, was shot in the face on Putin's birthday. Funny thing, that. So what was it? In fact, actually, both the Obama administration and the Bush administration did not put the values thing first. Quite the contrary. Rather, it was the very fact that as the Putin government became more authoritarian, and as people inside Russia began to protest this, challenge this, the reaction of the Russian government was, the Americans must be behind us. Moreover, as the Putin government became authoritarian, when they saw other governments that were also authoritarian get overthrown, again, not primarily because of U.S. intervention, but rather because of the dynamic we talked about, because in a lot of these places like Ukraine, Georgia, the Arab Spring in 2011, right? The Arab Spring in 2011, when people spontaneously went into the streets in places like Tunisia and Egypt, the U.S. government did not have anything to do with that. On the contrary, the U.S. government was caught completely by surprise. Like, what are these people? What are they doing? Before that, the consensus was that Arab regimes don't get overthrown for being repressive. Arab dictatorships are here forever. 2011 blows that up. For someone like Putin, he looked at that and said, well, the Americans are on the march. And if I let them overthrow someone like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, if I let them continue to overthrow someone like Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine, well, maybe I'm going to be next. And then, lo and behold, in 2011, 2012, with that parliamentary election, the Duma election, that Clinton in turn made the temerity to actually just comment on, his reaction was, aha, I am next. They are coming after me. More than anything else, that is what poisoned the relationship and set us on the course that we're on right now. Right? And that puts us in a very, very tough spot with the Russians, because this isn't about, it would be very easy if it was, if only we gave them more respect, if only we were nice to them, if only we had given them more money in the 1990s. And there is a view that makes this argument, that we wronged them. By the way, that's also the view that they would articulate. You did this to us, you attacked us, not the other way around. I think that the reality, if you study it, if you look at it closely, is actually much more challenging. It is rooted very much in the character of the Putin government, which in turn means that as long as the Putin government is there, our relationship is going to be intrinsically rivalrous and tense. And that doesn't mean that we end up in World War III. That doesn't mean that we end up going to war with each other at all. But it does mean that the relationship is ultimately, if we can put it this way, one of the popular phrases is always like, things that unite us are more important than things that divide us. And that's true in this country. It's true in this country. But with Russia, the reality is that the things that divide us are actually much more important, I would submit, than the things that unite us. Those interests that we have in common, and they are legitimate interests that we have in common, ultimately matter less than the things that divide us, which are rooted in fundamentally different forms of government.
Thank you.
So can I add also, I think it's important to remember if we're thinking about the U.S.'s place in the world, Russia isn't the only country in Europe that's turning toward authoritarian regimes, and the mechanisms by which those regimes are coming to power are actually fairly diverse. So some of them, so for example, if you look at Hungary, which was of course one of the countries with that started a mixed economy earliest during socialism and did capitalist reforms really early, had a strong economic growth. Now Viktor Orban, who's the current president, has made massive strides to just consolidate power, not only in federal government, but also in the regions as well. And he recently won the election with a substantial majority that, similar to the Russian elections, you have evidence of election manipulation, but you don't necessarily have evidence that there's outright fraud. So that means that there are a lot of people who actually legitimately support the election of these people who are gaining power in authoritarian ways. I think that's really important to remember, because it's not as if it's just the US and Russia and Europe is just sitting there waffling in the middle, right? Orban's government there's evidence that he has received funding from the Putin regime. This benefits Putin to have authoritarian regimes in Central and Eastern Europe as well. The other really important example is Poland, which, interestingly, similarly to Ukraine, also has a lot of anti-Russia sentiment in their political reforms after the fall of socialism, including a very large revolution to bring down the communist regime in Poland. There we've seen a political party known as it's PAS in Polish, and I always try to call it Peace and Justice, but it's Law and Justice. So Law and Justice has basically made all these moves to also consolidate power, again by appointing justices, forcing justices to retire early, not necessarily trying to do the sort of electoral manipulations that we see in Russia, but also using really effective and really long-term mechanisms to establish and hold power. And I think that's really important for the way that the US sort of sees its place in using Eastern Europe and Central Europe as a buffer zone between Western Europe and Russia. Similarly, we saw during Euromaidan especially, but also if you recall in July 2014 when Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 was shot down in Ukraine and over 200 people were killed, there wasn't really that much of a response to that type of event. And there really isn't that much of a response on the part of Europe, and it's hard to say what the US's role in that should be. So I think it's important to remember that there's a lot of actors who are involved with a lot of different states, and what the US I think assumed would happen in Central and Eastern Europe at the end of socialism was that they would just embrace capitalism because it would be awesome and they'd make a lot of money. And now we're starting to see regressions that have, I think, less to do with the economy and more to do with the political gravitations that are happening, where it's really hard to see whether Europe or in the US and the Western world is actually a better offer than Russia. Don't forget that Putin basically bought out Viktor Yanukovych to sign the association agreement with the European Union, which would have given Ukraine loans to do infrastructural projects and to do economic reforms and would create a free trade agreement with the European Union. Putin was like, I'll give you $15 billion. And Viktor Yanukovych was like, I need $15 billion, that's a great idea. Which it was. I mean, let's be honest, they needed money, so money seemed like a great idea. So, the mechanisms that these countries are using and that Russia is using to have influence in these places, it's also, there's a logic involved. It's not just Yanukovych is a terrible dictator.
So just two things. One, I gotta tell the story. So Mikhail Saakashvili, who was the president of Georgia, and kind of truly larger in the personality and size. I mean, he's just like a giant. His hands are like the size of basically my torso. Once I was having lunch with him during the uprising in Ukraine, and he said, look, I know Yanukovych, we were both in power at the same time. This thing about him being pro-Russian is totally wrong. This guy is actually not pro-Russian. There's only one thing which really I ever saw Viktor get really, really excited about. That, if you were sitting down at this meal, that would get him excited and animated, and that's stealing things. He loves to steal things. And he took a tremendous pride in sort of describing, here's how and by stealing things, we don't mean your watch. We mean like, like millions and millions of dollars of money from various enterprises. And he described in sort of great detail and with great excitement, like, here's how I like did this, and like, here's where I put the money, and like, here's how I got it to Switzerland. He was really excited about it. And so that kind of kleptocracy was something which Putin is very, very expertly exploited. Not least because that's also how his own regime is based, right? Which is about also stealing, just an enormous amount of theft. Just to echo the other point, yeah, one of the dangers is that when a government looks strong and capable, it will attract emulators. And probably one of the most destructive things about 2016 is that, it looked like, the Russians gave the appearance that they had like managed to like run out on the field during the Super Bowl and get away with it, right? Like they hacked a U.S. presidential election. Like it doesn't get any better than that. And so that in turn, it's presented a model which a lot of other countries around the world, a lot of people would look to that and say like, yeah, you know what? Actually, like that does look like success. That does look strong. Why don't we give that a shot? Now, we can talk about this more. I would actually argue, like, that is, you guys know what Potemkin Village is? This was famous during the time of Catherine the Great, where, they basically, her court wanted to make her think that there was more progress in the country, so they put up big villages, like in a Mel Brooks movie. This is kind of a Potemkin regime, in that the strength that it puts forward as an image is actually not nearly so deep as it actually appears. But nonetheless, you can fool a lot of people, right? Like, it also turned out that in hindsight, communism was a remarkably bad idea. It didn't work very well. Nonetheless, like, it took several decades for people to kind of fully internalize that. And there are actually still a couple in like academia who haven't gotten the memo on that one. But like, you can trick people for a while. And so that's one of the consequences, unfortunately, of it looking like the Putin government has been effective.
Thank you. So this will probably be our last question before we move on to audience questions. So
The lightning round.
So do you think this kind of form of cyber warfare is going to become adopted by more countries? Do you think we're going to see like Hungary and Poland adopt it? And do you think it's going to become the future of kind of influencing other nations and countries?
So I think we already are seeing that, right? There's no question but that some of the techniques that the Russians have pioneered are being imitated by others. The Iranians, there was just a big drop from Twitter where they basically revealed several million fake accounts. The largest number were Russian, associated with that Internet Research Agency, but a smaller crop were Iranian. They weren't done very well. The Russians were definitely getting like the greatest points for style. But absolutely, when something looks like it works, others are going to try to copy it. Likewise, with the proliferation of touch points, the Internet of Things, the fact that like sensors are ubiquitous, right? That all of us have a phone, that everything is connected to the Internet. All that creates enormous opportunities for cyber attack, exploitation, surveillance. That just didn't exist before. I'll give you another example. There's a fantastic, if you're interested in this topic, there's a group at the University of Toronto called Citizen Lab, which does spectacular work on looking at one of the problems of cyber surveillance. So in this case, you have the Saudis and the Emiratis who do not have an indigenous capability to do this. They do not know how to. They don't have an NSA or an Internet Research Agency or a GCHQ, the British equivalent, or an Israeli 8200 advanced cyber capability. But they've gone essentially to the private sector and they've bought it. They've rented it, and then they're using cyber attacks to spy on dissidents, including here in the United States, where you get a text message on your phone that looks like it's from a friend of yours, and you click on it, and they're on your phone. So there's no question that this is just sort of a new reality that we're going to be dealing with. And that unfortunately the Russians have kind of paved the way. It's a great phrase by David Sanger, who's a wonderful New York Times reporter. He's got a great book on the subject of cyber war. If you're interested in it, you should read it. It's called The Perfect Weapon. It came out a few months ago. He talks about the idea of Central and Eastern Europe being Putin's petri dish. That this was sort of a petri dish where various tactics were developed, and then in turn they got deployed against us. That same dynamic also is going to take place as other governments either develop these capabilities on their own, or in other cases will go to the Russians and say, you know, in the same way that the Russians and we sell weapons, conventional weapons, to our allies and partners. So too, you can see how in the cyber realm, they'll look to major powers for help to be able to do things like this.
And I would give two further examples. Probably most of you have followed the stories about Macedonia, where people are buying real Facebook profiles from others and then turning them into American profiles and then sharing clickbait kind of news stories and creating Facebook groups and that sort of thing that get circulated really widely. So they can't be as easily cracked down on as bots because they're actually real people, right? So they were created based on some actual person. But they're used with the same mechanism, and of course Facebook has no real control over what they do with those things. But last week there was an interesting article in the New York Times that was basically saying that there's evidence now that people based in the US have started to do the same thing, which is to basically create new profiles and try to circulate this kind of information. Basically that Americans are now mirroring Russian technologies to do the job that the Russians were trying to do in the first place. And that kind of full circle thing I found is interesting, but also sort of sad. Sort of sad. Yeah.
Thank you. So now we're going to move on to audience questions. So if anybody has any questions they would like to ask the speakers, they can go ahead and raise their hand.
You could also offer insults or...
I want to go back
I like how the
to...
hands went up then, only then.
We don't really raise hands. Anyways, so I want to go back to Putin. You were talking about that, and I'm just wondering, like, what would the next Putin be, and what is Russia without Putin? And I don't understand, like, are they truly nationalistic, or is it you're leading to submission thing, or is it like the cult of personality left over from like Stalin? What is your guys' opinion on that, and like what?
It's hard to say. I am of the strong opinion that getting rid of Putin alone is not actually going to change Russian politics. As we saw, and if you, I'll give a shout out to the Hattinger Center that funds my postdoc. On Friday, on Friday at 1:15, Mikhail Zygar is coming to campus to give a talk. He is one of the founders of TV Dozh, which is one of the main opposition news channels in Russia right now, still functioning, which is remarkable, right from the internet. So he's coming to campus, and I think he would probably have a lot to say about that. But his book, which is really spectacular, argues, you know, that Medvedev, who you mentioned as this sort of interregnum person who was president when Putin stepped back to be prime minister, actually had the capacity. He was a liberal person, and he actually had it in him to look at the U.S. and look at democratization and see it not as a threat, but as a possibility. And that didn't happen because of the strength of not just Putin, but everybody else around him, who created this institution that means that power transfer doesn't actually change how the regime works.
But how could there not be a change? Like, this is a man that proposed to his wife, and she thought he was breaking up with her. Like she thought they were breaking up. Like, he's like,
Because
he's
the
very
structure
strong,
that's
like,
in-
there has to be
yeah.
some sort of change.
The structure that's in place, though, I think, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I would think it's a Potemkin situation. I think there's an actual, there's a mechanism that works there that people have faith in. And so I think there are, I mean, Russia is not going to elect an actual opposition politician to the presidency. So who else is there? Everybody else who has power is a Putin buddy. So that would be my concern. Is you can't elect Alexei Navalny. He's in jail all the time.
So you've got, I mean, you have institutions and you also have personalities.
Yes.
Right? And the reason that historians get paid money is to argue about how do you weight these things relatively. So, you know, my personal view is if you had swapped Putin with someone else, would Russia today be, you know, a bigger version of Poland? Probably not, right? Because those institutions do matter, right? The fact that after 1991, there was kind of, I think that the American attitude was like, this is a greenfield site. Now we get, you know, it's all gone. Now you get to sort of build your liberal palace on top of what, you know, it's just this empty field. The thing is, it wasn't an empty field, right? Like, how many judges, independent, properly trained judges did you have in Russia? How many ex-KGB agents did you have in Russia in 1991? All right? The most important, like the Soviet Union, the flag went down in 1991, but the institutional legacy absolutely did live on. A superpower, by the way, you notice that most post-Soviet republics, with the exception of the Baltic states, look a lot like Russia. Right? You end up with a very, very strong executive. You end up with basically a rubber stamp legislature, and then you have some courts, which don't do very much of anything. Weak property rights, right? Now, in some cases, like that takes a much more malevolent and frightening form in Russia. Less so, you know, in the case of, say, Kazakhstan, because there isn't a geopolitical imperative associated with Kazakhstan, or Uzbekistan, or Kyrgyzstan, or Azerbaijan. But those structures you clearly see across. Now, that being said, personalities also do matter. Vladimir Putin is an unusually, I think, capable, shrewd guy. He's not a dummy, right? And so,
Not
you
a
know,
cult of personality, but he's borderline.
well, so the cult of personality, there has been a cult of personality that's built up, but the flip side of that is, you know, if there's another leader, you can build up another cult of personality. Where the protecting village thing comes in is like, here's a question for you guys. Is it a great idea to concentrate so much power in the hands of one person? Right? If you look around the world, a lot of countries are basically making that bet. If you think about Erdogan in Turkey, you think about Orbán in Hungary, you think about Duterte in the Philippines, for that matter, even places that were not remotely democratic, Saudi Arabia, China, have gone in the direction away from collective leadership in favor of there's going to be a guy, and he's going to be in charge, and he's going to make all the decisions, and he's paramount. Right? That's Xi Jinping, who's accumulated unprecedented control in that system since Mao. A system, by the way, that after Mao was very deliberately disassembled. That's MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. You may have heard of him. He's been in the news a little bit lately. Right? Now, is that a good idea? The Russian case is, look at the success that we've achieved. This is totally a good idea. What's the alternative? The alternative is the mess and the gridlock, and it's the, you know, D's and the R's never agreeing on anything. It's the United States. Look at the mess that is. Do you want that mess, or do you want Vladimir Putin? Obvious, right? My own argument is, you know, in the long run, putting all of the power in the hands of one guy actually does not end up so hot. That more often than not, it ends up blowing up in your face. And that for all that Putin is actually proven to be a very impressive tactician, Russia is basically still stuck in the same position that they've been stuck in from the get-go. The economy is not diversified. It hasn't been able to diversify the economy. Geopolitically, they're isolated from Europe and the United States. They've made enemies where they otherwise did not have to make enemies. They have moved into alignment with China, but that's not going to be a relationship of equals. Technologically, demographically, economically, Russia is stuck in a position of inferiority vis-a-vis the West, and Putin has no solution for that problem. And in the long run, like, they are declining power. They are not on an upswing. They have been able to come up with all sorts of fiendishly creative things to try to obscure this reality. But that is the fundamental underlying reality. They are Pakistan to the West's India. Right? Like, Pakistan cannot catch up with India. There's no way that Pakistan catches up with India. What Pakistan can do is have nuclear weapons and terrorism to kind of make some noise. They can hurt India, but they can't catch up with India. And the problem for Putin is that at the end of the day, Russians do benchmark themselves against the West. Now, the one thing we also didn't talk about is like, okay, so, is there anything that we can, how do you push back? This regime has one tremendous, tremendous Achilles heel. It's the biggest Achilles heel of them all. I like how I built up the drama. It's good, right? It's corruption. It's corruption. You can go around the world today and talk about democracy and human rights, and the bad guys actually have a pretty ready response to that. Well, it's not our culture and democracy. Like, what is this democracy of which you speak? Is it the democracy of Bush v. Gore? Is it the democracy of Donald Trump? Human rights, Abu Ghraib. You want to talk about human rights? Corruption is a very tough thing. There's not a culture on earth, even places where corruption is a way of life, that takes pride in corruption. It's a shameful thing everywhere. It's a deeply shameful thing. Now, the Russian regime, the system that Putin has built over the last 20 years, is built on corruption. That's what it's built on. It's built on the ability of people to steal. Right? That's, by the way, like why you want a government job in Russia. Right? Some of you probably want government jobs. By the way, who here has ever had to, who's paid a bribe to a policeman? Raise your hand. What, in this country?
No.
Where?
Russia.
Russia. Important caveat, right? Who here, you guys are in college, who here, in order to get a good grade, how many of you have bribed a professor? In order to get the grade. Because he or she is expected. Raise your hand.
Monetary bribe?
Maybe I shouldn't ask that.
No, yeah, that's actually not really wrong, but
Yes, that you've given money. No hands go up. Okay, you can tell me if you actually, the truth is, come tell me afterwards, probably someone should go. This is absolutely endemic in Russia. Right? By the way, it's also why the most powerful sanction that the U.S. has put in place against Russia, the thing which caused the Russians to go berserk more than anything else, was in 2012 with the Magnitsky Act. What's the Magnitsky Act? The Magnitsky Act was in response to basically a Russian lawyer who had uncovered a scheme of corruption involving the Interior Ministry, involving the police, which he decided to blow the whistle on. In response to blowing the whistle on the corruption inside the police, he was arrested, beaten, tortured, and died an excruciating death in prison, being denied medical treatment. Congress, in turn, decided to pass legislation that said something very simple. In the event that you committed a extreme human rights abuse or are implicated in an extreme act of corruption, very simple. You can't get a visa to the United States. You can't get access to the U.S. financial system. You can't bank in the United States. Not a big deal, right? Actually, yes, a very big deal. But here's the other thing about a corrupt regime. When you steal stuff, it's very important that you therefore have to get it out of the place that you stole it. Why? Because someone else can steal it. Right? Thieves have a very, very good appreciation for the importance of property rights. So you have to get it out. You have to take your stealings and you have to put them into the apartment in London. You have to get them out. You have to put them into the New York real estate, right? You got to get them into the Swiss bank account. The Magnitsky Act was the first thing that the U.S. did, which basically put a gun directly at that system. So by the way, when the Russians sent, when the Russian government sent one of its agents to go to the Trump Tower in 2016 to talk about, how can we get this relationship back on track? What was the thing that they raised? The Magnitsky Act. How do we get rid of the Magnitsky Act? The corruption is the Achilles heel of the regime. It's also the reason why the most effective campaigner against the regime, the person who has actually been the most effective in stirring things up, is Alexei Navalny. Navalny is a blogger. That's how he got his start. All he did was essentially crowdsourced reporting on corruption. Had a blog and said, if you have documents, if you have evidence of corruption, send it to me and I'll post it. People could do. You take a photo with your phone and some documents, and it says that oh look, here's a contract for something that's worth nothing, which somehow someone was getting $1 gazillion for. That's kind of strange. And so he started posting this. And then he started criticizing the government itself because he think that the government would respond by saying, this is great, thank you, Mr. Citizen, for exposing this horrible corruption. You're saving the taxpayer money. The response instead was, you're an enemy of the state. And that's when he began to start calling the party associated with Putin the party of crooks and liars. That gets people motivated. And that's true for all of the regimes that we're talking about in this space. The corruption is critical.
Going back to a little bit about more like in America, why do you guys not think there's so much panic? Like, we understand we've been hacked in the presidential election and it's continuing to happen, it's going to keep happening. Why do you think people aren't panicking? Why do you think people aren't taking action?
I think it's because people don't see democracy threatened. So I'm a firm believer, having experienced, authoritarianism, it comes kind of quietly, and there's not that much, it's kind of hard to notice. It comes little by little. Viktor Yanukovych changed the Constitution to give himself more power, and then proceeded to change the judiciary, and then proceeded to change, the media, and that sort of thing. And by the time you actually got to the point where he got overthrown, things looked a lot different than they did 5 years earlier when he got elected. And I think perhaps in Ukraine, people got mad because their democracy was not very old. And so they understood that in order, that they had some power in that situation, and that really if they actually came into the streets and literally gave their lives, they could change something. And I just simply don't think that Americans think that our democracy is going to go away. And I don't think that people think that this is an actual feasibility. And it is. It's absolutely feasible. So that's not a very happy answer, optimistic one, but be careful. Authoritarianism is real.
I would second the authoritarianism is real and it's bad. Controversial things you'll hear tonight. We'll prefer to say authoritarianism, no bueno. I would say though, I don't think that the appropriate response is panic. Right? The Russians are not 10 feet tall. Putin is not omnipotent. One of my favorite reactions, so some of my dear Russian friends, in watching the news coverage of Russia since 2016, have said, man, we don't recognize the country which is being depicted in the news. According to this, we apparently live in this place where, the government's super competent and everyone's really disciplined and, we have these amazing capabilities, and they're like, that's not our country. Our country's a mess. The government is actually, Putin's on top of it, but it's a bunch of feuding bureaucracies. It's incredibly corrupt. We're not that good. The joke that one of them had is you guys describe us like we're Germans. We're not German, we're Russian. We're a mess. I'm not in any way, shape, or form diminishing the severity of the threat posed by what Russia has done, by what Russia continues to want to try to do. What I would say, though, is, first, when we are not complacent, we're not in great shape, right? At the risk of sounding a little bit hubristic, when we remember that we're the superpower and they're not, they get into a lot of trouble. Right? For a long time, we just weren't really paying that much attention. And when I say we, I'm not talking about the American people. I would include the American government. And many people who were involved in 2016 inside the government, I think today would freely say, we had a lot of options, we didn't exercise them. Right? There were numerous retaliatory options that we kind of deterred ourselves out of doing. When we get our act together, Russia is not, it's not the Soviet Union. This is a country with the economy the size of Italy. And so, you know, the other side of it is, do they try to stir up this unrest, this social division? Yes, they do. But ultimately, like, who gets to decide how that plays out? Well, it's us, right? Our fate is very much in our own hands. It's not going to be dictated by the Russians. It's up to us whether we respond appropriately, whether we, and some of that, a lot of that is government, and then some of that is just the way that we think about our own political discourse, in which all of you get to be able to play a role in.
Yeah, we'll have time for one more quick question. You want to go?
What's the next step in U.S. cyber defense? I mean, it's obvious that our cyber defense is very weak when teenagers can hack state elections just through simple SQL injections.
You said offense or defense?
Defense. It's obvious that our defense is weak as SQL injections done by teenagers can reach our entire defense system. Yet offensive technology is just getting better and better as things such as the Internet of Things that you mentioned and machine learning and that sort of thing advances on. I think it's much more difficult to defend against it, but it's still just incredibly weak.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a couple of challenges, right? The first is that much of what needs to be defended is not in the hands of government, it's in the hands of the private sector. Right? And so it's a question of sort of aligning incentives properly, because government is not going to be in a position of providing cyber defense for every company. Even utilities, right, it becomes a little bit more complicated and challenging. Also, the fact that we've got a federal system, so a lot of power also gets devolved to states. There's an information imbalance that's associated with that as well, because, you know, NSA may see something, but if it's taking place in the top secret realm, how do you get that information in a credible way to the people who need to know that they themselves are under attack? So it's a fiendishly difficult problem. The fact, kind of post-Edward Snowden, that the NSA also became a dirty word. And then Americans are, in my view, incorrectly, overly concerned with government spying on them, when in fact, actually, the legal restrictions on the government doing electronic surveillance on American citizens are extraordinary. You should be much more worried about Facebook and Google and other companies spying on you, which they're doing constantly. But you know, one proposal which has been put forward is the idea of maybe having kind of a national cyber defense center. We have something called NCTC, which is the National Counterterrorism Center, which sort of tries to knit together various parts of government in order to provide an effective response to terrorism threats. Suggestions have been made that, you know, the British have something like this, and that this would be a good structure to replicate. But you know, the other side of it is, in order to have a better defense, we probably also are going to need to have a better offense. And so one thing the Trump administration has done publicly, the details have not been disclosed. It's been reportedly to kind of loosen the rules associated with offensive operations that Cybercom, the U.S. Cyber Command, and the NSA can conduct. In effect, you know, and this is also extremely difficult. It's much harder than in the nuclear space for a variety of reasons. You need to be able to convince foreign governments to think twice before they do certain things. Right? That's tough because of the problem of attribution. It's a lot easier in the case of nukes, like back in the 1950s. You know, like you could kind of watch it coming. Okay, well, like wherever it came from, that they're going to have a very bad day. It's more challenging in the case of cyber, although some would argue that the attribution problem has technical solutions that if we put more effort into, we can close the gap on.
All right, I think that's all we have time for today. I hope you guys enjoyed our discussion. If you're interested in learning more about Alexander Hamilton Society, my internal VP is going to have a list up. If you want to put your email down, I'll shoot you an email and tell you a little bit more about when our meetings are and such. Oh my gosh, yes.
No, I just want to say, if you want somebody else's opinion about the future of the Putin regime, tomorrow night is the International Studies Grace and Kirk lecture. Dr. Graham Robertson is coming, and his new book is called Putin versus the People. So he might actually have an even different answer to that question, but I would encourage you all to come to that lecture.
I would go with that. He sounds like he knows way more than I do. So.
He definitely, I read some of his stuff, he knows a So it's been great. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Let's give him another round of applause.